Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Andreou. Bruce Lee famously once quipped that he did not fear a man who had practiced 10,000 kicks, but a man who had practiced one kick 10,000 times. Seekers of influence seem to be heeding the message. There has been a notable shift away from trying to exert influence by making political donations. It is cheaper to plug into the people who have practiced the specific kick you favor 10,000 times. Enter the lobbying think tank. Why pay for the monkey when it is cheaper to offer the future organ grinder an internship? Politicians depend on think tanks more and more for policy formulation, so what we have seen is a carousel of grooming. People are trained up and farmed out to parties, to media organizations, to other think tanks. Why pay a politician to ask a question of a minister when you can buy a TV station or social media platform and demand their attention directly instead? Along with that biodome come a set of new opportunities. Debates which, at least on this side of the Atlantic, were considered settled, like climate science or the value of vaccination or LGBT rights, are being cracked open once again by people with money who disagree with that settled view. One such notable area is women's reproductive health, actually part of a larger piece that questions women's liberation more generally. Here is GB News' Patrick Christie's with a typically measured reaction to the recent change in the law.
Britain has sleepwalked into becoming a country that kills babies. Just 2 hours of debate, that's it. Britain has now decriminalised abortion. A woman can decide that she doesn't want the baby, even at the moment she is having the baby. So people like that who claim to be feminists, OK, will say that this is in some way a good thing for women's rights, right? But where are they when it comes to issues like Afghan men raping women in Britain? Where are they on that? It does make me wonder whether or not Labour is now the party of death.
I spoke to investigative journalist Peter Geoghegan of the superb Democracy for Sale substack about the porous system through which such money is flowing into British politics in ever greater amounts, yet largely unseen, and how electoral law is struggling to stop the last egregious bit of interference from happening again, let alone try to anticipate how the next one might happen. Welcome, Peter. Nice to have you back.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex. Delighted to be here.
We are returning to this theme that we've talked about a lot of times, the theme of dark money flowing into the UK system, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly through various organizations and think tanks and all of that. And on the latter, you've just done quite a thorough investigation on some funding coming from the United States that's specifically attached to anti-abortion activists. Tell us about that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, so I've in recent, probably quite a few listeners, I've noticed in the last few months, and to be fair, in the last few years, there's been a kind of increase in the kind of the level of noise from opponents of abortion legislation in the United Kingdom. And, you know, we saw last week Nigel Farage was talking about, who previously described himself as pro-choice, described these proposals that are currently, that a cross-party group of MPs have around decriminalising abortion, which is currently criminalised after 24 weeks of decriminalising abortion. He said this was ludicrous. And what struck me about that, and I'd already actually been working on this story before Farage said this, was that this is part of a kind of a wider pattern of things we're seeing. We had a lot of stuff around these abortion buffer zones, this legislation that's in the UK and Scotland as well, Scottish government, around kind of basically prohibiting protests outside in these kind of buffer zones around clinics which deliver abortion. And what was really striking to me about a lot of this stuff is that we've seen an increase in kind of court cases around these issues in the UK, increase in kind of some kind of people, especially on the fringe of the Conservative Party, talking about this issue. But almost most strikingly, we've seen US politicians start to get really interested in abortion legislation in the UK. We saw J.D. Vance at his infamous Munich summit speech actually singling out Britain and Scotland. We've seen press releases, Twitter threads from official US government bodies criticising the UK, accusing it of attacking free speech, of censoring people because they're not allowed to protest outside abortion clinics. So I was looking at all that. So I was like, well, actually, I want to find out a bit more about what's going on here. So myself and my colleague Max Colbert, who's doing some freelance work for Democracy for Sale, we started looking at the funding that was going into UK organisations from the US. And one of the ironies of Britain is we've actually got very little transparency in a lot of areas, and America has actually often got better transparency. So we're able to look through US filings to see what kind of anti-abortion activists were putting money into the UK. And we discovered a few interesting things. The headline for our story was we discovered that the Free Speech Union, which is Toby Young, now Tory peer, Lord Young, that they had received almost $100,000 from an organisation called Charitable Allies, which is run by a guy called Zachary Kester. Zachary Kester is a very well-known anti-abortion lawyer. He works closely with a group called Students for Life, which effectively is a campus anti-abortion organisation. He takes court cases with them. He works with lots of other anti-abortion groups in the US. And so they'd received almost $100,000 from him in 2021. And we asked him where the money, what the money was for, but we still haven't got a response from them. But it was interesting, to see somebody like this funding work in the UK. We also saw that the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is a very big, very prominent, probably the most important anti-abortion organisation in the world, really credited with doing away with Roe versus Wade in the US, that in the UK, their spending and their funding from the US has tripled in less than 5 years. And this matters because the ADF often pay for court cases. So some of these big high-profile court cases, which do make the news, especially around buffer zones, but also around things like, you might remember the Battersby case, which was a child who was on life support and was never going to recover. The decision was taken to turn off their life support. They took a court case against that. So they've been very, very involved. So we can kind of see...
Didn't know they were involved in that.
Yes, they
that's
were involved in that as well.
Peter, can I just take you back a step? Because the litigation involvement has been there for a very long time, because I'm aware of it even as far back as equal marriage and the bakery case and all of that. I know that there are organizations that I guess come under a vague Christian umbrella, shall we say, that are very closely linked to Tea Party money, and all of that links to even projects like the Atlantic Bridge, which are now, I guess, almost 20 years old. I mean, the Atlantic Bridge had been undone by the time the coalition came into power. So there had always been that aspect of involvement in funding court cases on, I guess, ideological issues that interest those people. But the further step now is that there is a more direct political involvement. Is that what we're seeing?
I think that is kind of what we're seeing. I think you're right. This is not a new thing. And the idea, I've written about this a lot. My last book, I wrote about this quite a lot. I wrote about Atlantic Bridge. I looked at the relationship between these kind of US think tanks and UK think tanks. And this has definitely been existing for quite a while. But the political side really has changed. You have the US, the State Department Substack is actually worth listeners following. I'm surprised I'm saying this, but it's really interesting. They put out a statement on Substack last week saying, effectively, we're going to meddle in other people's elections. They were criticizing the Germans for describing the ADF, the Alternative for Germany, some of which has roots in the fascist past. They were criticizing the German government for describing them as extremists. They're very clearly the administration in the White House wants to get involved in these issues, and they want to frame them as in a free speech way. And that's why I think it was really interesting about that funding was going to the Free Speech Union, because they are trying to concoct this as a free speech story.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that because at the moment I'm doing a lot of work on my other project, Podyssey, I'm researching an episode about the island of Delos, which is of great mythological interest, but also was the center of the slave trade during the Hellenistic period. And what keeps coming up again and again is the link between far-right ideologies and ancient Greek and Roman culture, or rather selected bits of it. And I was blown away by the State Department mentioning this stuff, this largely discredited ahistorical bump about how the things that connect us is that we all come from a tradition of Roman and Greek liberty and democracy. Because very much that ancient Greek classical ideal is kind of the basis of a lot of the Nazi ideology that was going around. And I was just utterly stunned when you sent me the link that they were specifically referring to that stuff. They were going, we all come from this ancient Greek ideal, which is why we should be looking after each other, which means it's okay for us to meddle in your election.
I think this is the aspect that I think a lot of us have. By meaning us, I mean people like journalists, people who live in a kind of fact-based world, and we're often very wary. I'm often very wary, to be honest, Alex, of saying such and such is linked to such and such. You know, these two people know each other. Like, you can quickly look like a conspiracy theorist. And what I think has actually been really fascinating, grimly so, to watch as this becomes much more of an overt political project, is the kind of things that people like, you know, some people were saying, say, around Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation's pre-Trump administration kind of roadmap for what it should look like, which is very much where we are now, who were saying this was all hysterical, this was overblown, this was, you know, this is kind of the fever dream of the liberal left, etc. What's been striking is actually how much of this is not just real, but as you say, is rooted in quite anti-democratic ideas about how society should be run fundamentally. We are going back to a very, very pre-democratic idea of the social order. And as is often very common, rooting it in Greece and ancient Rome also, I think, is intentional, not just because of the ideas might come from there, but it also, and I think this is almost the most important bit, is that it gives it a sense of this isn't just some way of stitching everything up. This has got some sort of deeper philosophical meaning and reasoning, even if it doesn't.
Yeah, it gives it a sort of faux historical cover, doesn't it? This has always been our culture, and it's time to defend it now.
Exactly, and it kind of frames it in a way that says that we are actually going back, we've lost our roots. And I think this is really important. The things that we're seeing really strong here is this idea that we have lost our way, you know, which is often couched in religious terms as well. I must say, I've become, not just writing this story for Democracy for Sale that just went out, I've been generally become much more interested in, and we spoke about Paul Marshall on this podcast a few months ago.
Yeah.
You know, the way in which like very strong ideas of religiosity, and which are not just about personal belief, but are much more about how society should be organized. And again, often at best agnostic towards democracy, have become increasingly strengthened. And I think that kind of State Department also running through that like a stick of rock is a mix almost of a harking back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but also mixed in with a very muscular version of theology and a very muscular kind of Christian nationalist vision of theology.
And we may have privately discussed this before, but I'm also very interested in the emergence. I mean, it's not a new term, but certainly its increased use is quite new to my ears, of this notion of the Judeo-Christian tradition, this effort to merge the two as if they kind of go together, so that we're saying we're not leaving Israel out, they're our friends. It's just everyone else that's outside the bubble.
Yes, and you can see that language is becoming, you know, that's becoming a really big part of what they're trying. It's an enclosing of the democratic space. And what I think is fascinating about Britain is, you know, in some ways, these might seem like fringe things. Like talking about, you know, anti-abortion court cases in the UK might seem very fringe. But when you have the Vice President of the United States, as we had with J.D. Vance, publicly criticising the democratically elected government of Scotland about what it's doing on this issue. When you have the Department for Labour and Democracy increasingly misnomered, which is actually, that is the department that's been putting out all these press releases, again, like calling the judgment of the British courts, because the courts ruled in April that a Buffer's Own protester had broken the law by what they'd done. That was called out on social media by an arm of the American state. This is a huge difference. And I think it's one of the reasons I think it's really important to tell these stories and to start to investigate this, because what you will see by that's very nature, that conversation is much more present than it was this time 6 months ago in the public sphere, because of the very nature of the fact that what someone like J.D. Vance says makes news. It forces a government to respond. It puts these issues onto public domain. And I think Farage's intervention, Farage being interested in this is a real bellwether of that.
Quiet riot. Quiet riot.
What's interesting, however, is that my sense is that the direct intervention of people like Vance and Musk did not go down well. The background network of connecting people, connecting think tanks, funneling money that has been very much Bannon's project, it seems to me to work better. So is there a sense that we are moving back towards that? Because I did notice that the direct involvement of American politicians kind of reached a peak and now feels like it's tapering off a little bit.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. If you look at what happened in Australia and Canada, and actually look at what happened in Poland, where yes, they were involved, but it felt like it was less of an overt play.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite striking. I would agree with that. And I think it's why tracing the kind of money flows that I often look at in my work, I think are really significant for that reason. Because often, actually, as you say, like you can gain a lot more traction through using front organizations, through giving money to organizations in country to do the work on your behalf, or through to fellow travelers, than by actually getting involved yourself. Because exactly that, like people don't want to feel like, in both Australia and Canada, my read, I'm not an expert in either, but you basically had two candidates who are saying Canada first and Australia first. That looks really weak.
Yeah.
You've got your man going America first. You're saying that basically a kind of another version of it. But if what you're doing is funding court cases, is putting these ideas, so the ADF were also very involved with the All-Party Parliamentary Group. They write in their annual reports about briefing politicians. Strikingly, actually, their donations from the public have been going down, but their overall spending has been going up because they're getting more support from the US mothership, which is very, very rich. So the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, it's a US-based organization set up in the US about 30 years ago by a series of very prominent people on the conservative right. They're effectively what they would describe themselves as a legal advocacy group. They're trying to expand Christian religious practices within public schools and in government. They're known for, they've been very much outlawing abortions, a big issue for them. They've opposed same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, all of those sort of things, transgender rights. These are all big things the ADF has opposed very successfully. It's had lots and lots of Supreme Court wins. It often takes these cases in the US to go to the Supreme Court. It's based in the States. It's got a budget of over $100 million a year. It's got lots of connections into Trump world. Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he used to be an ADF attorney. The ADF has been very much in favor of what Trump has been doing. But they've also got branches all around the world. So there's an ADF International that's based in the UK. And so that's where I think there's much more traction, there's much more ability to actually influence the political conversation. In some ways, the direct involvement, but in our politics is not as clever as actually seeding these narratives in. And having someone like Farage pick them up as an outrider is really effective. And what I was doing is looking at the kind of transfers of money from the ADF in the US, from the central US organization to the UK ADF. And I found that it increased by over tripled in the last 5 years.
Do you sense that there is a shift of money happening from think tanks and organizations which are much more focused on the economic side of the conservative argument towards the social side of the conservative argument?
Without a doubt. It's fascinating, actually. It's most interesting to watch in the US. If you look at the big beasts of the think tank world, for want of a better word, the right-wing think tank world, the conservative think tank world, say 20 years ago, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, even some of the big institutes were funded by the Koch brothers. They were very much seen as the shock troops of neoliberalism and at times neoconservatism. Like the push to Iraq came out of organizations like this. Very, very fiscally conservative, low taxes, the kind of regime. George W. Bush's ideas came straight out of these places. Dick Cheney was very close as his vice president to the American Enterprise Institute. What we've seen and the kind of the dominance now of the Heritage Foundation, which is where Project 2025 came out of, these are much more about social conservatism. This is what is at their grassroots. This is what they're driven by culture wars issues far more than economic issues. And I think it's really striking that you can see some of the most vocal anti-Trump people in the US are actually the kind of the never Trumpers. These are the Republicans who now kind of despise the Republican Party. And often they are people who came out of these think tank worlds, came out of people like David Frum, who came out very much of this world and look now slightly in shock at what they've seen, because this world is now really dominated more and more by social conservatism. And that is where the money is going. And I think you can see that in the UK as well. Like if you
definitely.
if you look at what the think tanks in the UK, look at what Policy Exchange writes about now compared to what it wrote about 10 or 15 years ago.
Yes, I would say there is a direct correlation between the chair space think tanks get on the BBC and their prominence, in a way. Even 15 years ago, places like the Adam Smith Institute or the Taxpayers Alliances or the Centre for Social Justice were much more prominent. And now you have a big shift towards the other rump of think tanks that are much more willing to talk about abortion, to talk about trans rights, equal marriage, and things like that. And you do see a shift away from the idea of the free market and trickle-down economics, because actually this kind of social policy is very state interventionist. It does involve the state interfering to legislate about people's lives and choices. And so it doesn't quite fit with a Thatcherite ethos of the more traditional free market think tanks, I think.
No, I would agree. And the thing that's interesting with the think tanks, the kind of Tufton Street world, this kind of nexus around Tufton Street in central London, is that also because they don't declare their donors, they often rely on money flows. Where is money coming from? And you can actually see there's more interest, I think, from people who want to influence the agenda on this side of the debate. And you can see, like, the Institute of Economic Affairs, I think, is a fascinating think tank. It's the oldest think tank in the world in this kind of neoliberal model. Very influential. Liz Truss was said to have been incubated by them. Tim Montgomery said. And if you look at them now, they have a lot of influence on the Truss government, a lot of influence in the Brexit years, really very much there. Mark Littlewood, who used to run them, has now gone to work for Liz Truss and the popcons, all they're very much in that world. They now really are, they're just gone back to being a kind of Thatcherite think tank and releasing kind of constantly press releases, kind of excoriating not just the Labour government, but also the Conservatives and Reform. Whereas people who are pushing into the culture war space, who are not just saying, abortion's not an issue that we really have a huge care about. People like the IA, I think, would probably be like, these are personal choices. They're not really issues that we get that involved with. But you can actually see much more that this is becoming a big thing for on the think tank space.
Yeah, which has, of course, the strange effect that I find myself occasionally agreeing with them now and thinking, what's happening? Why are they talking sense suddenly? Linked to that, there was an item in the news recently that went fairly unnoticed, I think, about Reform UK beginning to accept donations in cryptocurrency. What's your instinctive reaction to that?
I thought this was very, very interesting. I've latterly been really following the cryptocurrency story. I think it's, what we've seen now is, again, because the tail is wagging the dog, we have an American administration in which the President of the United States, it should be mentioned, the President of the United States put out his own meme coin, which is basically valueless, and has already made at least $300 million off it and stands to make a lot more. So that's the backdrop to this. And Trump, one, was very skeptical of Bitcoin. He actually, and of cryptocurrency, generally called it a scam. Trump, too, is the exact opposite. He's completely embraced it. So in one respect, I didn't think it was a coincidence that you now see someone like Nigel Farage embracing it too. But I think the biggest aspect of this is that, you've got, on one level, it adds another layer of potential opacity to political donations for sure. It will be easier. I know pro-crypto people will come in and say, look, it's a blockchain, you can't do it with the blockchain, you see where the money is coming from, you can see everything. Yes and no, frankly. There's a reason why money launderers love cryptocurrency, and it's not because it's very transparent.
But I thought its whole shtick is that you couldn't see where the money was coming from.
Effectively, the idea is it's playing both sides off against each other. It's saying you can see the validity of the money through the blockchain, but it allows for anonymity in terms of who's behind some of this stuff. So there's a whole regulatory issue there about how would we even go about trying to vet some of these political donations. But the bigger piece of this, I think, in some ways, is actually the fact that Reform are in spaces where they're clearly having conversations with the kind of people who do have Bitcoin, the kind of people who have Bitcoin to give, the kind of people who have money to give in politics. Yeah. And what this, I think, is a bigger part of is two things are happening. Reform wants to be seen as the successor to the Tories in terms of not just politics, but in terms of money in politics. They are trying to raise huge amounts of money. And it's quite clear that they will use every single loophole that currently exists to do so. We've seen and we know that Nick Candy, the Reform Treasurer, and I said Tory there because he used to be a Tory donor. He used to be a big Tory donor. Now he's a Reform Treasurer. He's been out in Monaco and other places, other tax havens, trying to elicit donations from, well, I might call them immigrants, but let's call them expats, to use a lingua franca, who are now all allowed to donate because the Conservative government increased how long you can continue to donate and to vote after you leave the UK. I think it's a really big issue. I think the fact that, the extent to which our regulatory system around money and politics is broken is hard to overstate. But one fact I think is always worth mentioning is that the maximum fine for breaking electoral law is £20,000. £20,000 for breaking electoral law. That is really nothing. And a lot of this stuff if there is even an investigation, it's very rare because the Independence of the Electoral Commission is gone now. It's no longer independent. That was taken away by the Johnson government. There's very rarely investigations. And even if there are, they take a long time. With something like a donation, say there's a huge donation in Bitcoin that comes to the reform a week before a general election, 2 weeks before a general election, a month before a general election. That won't even show up. By the time we're looking at that, the horse is bolting, is running around the field. It's like what we saw Vote Leave and how they broke the law during the Brexit referendum. And so what Nigel Farage, I think, is doing there is signalling, not just around donations in Bitcoin, but more generally, the door is open here. And he is in spaces like in the US. What's fascinating about the crypto story is huge amounts of cryptocurrency, huge amounts of people in the crypto world became big donors to Trump and the Republican Party. Yeah. And one of the reasons they did that was because they realized how cheap it was. These are guys who've made a lot of hot money. They could start throwing out 10, 20, $30 million without really thinking about it. That's the kind of thing that Farage wants to tap into, in my view. He wants to tap into the people who've got that kind of capital and that kind of cash.
Quiet riot. Quiet riot.
The meme coin especially, it's become a completely open way to basically bribe Trump directly. I mean, there are stories now in the US about someone buying 3 million worth of Trump's coin, and then suddenly the case that was being pursued against them being thrown out of the Department of Justice, and then they pop up at a dinner with Trump. It's not even hidden anymore, is what I'm trying to say. My first worry and reaction when I saw the crypto story was that I think if you manage to combine a completely electronic currency with an automated AI way of making a large series of small donations, that's where I think it becomes really, really dangerous. Because I can see a situation where a series of donations are made below the amount that is caught by Electoral Commission rules, that needs to be individually declared, that has limitations as to the person needing to be a UK citizen or whatever. You could engineer a situation where if I have a couple of million of crypto to donate, I could easily generate a technical way of doing it in a series of 100,000 £20 donations, right? And then it's not caught.
Yeah.
So
And we saw this actually already.
Yeah, because there was an issue with PayPal, I think, at the last election, wasn't there? And there was an issue with loads of small £5 donations coming via PayPal to someone.
There was a lot of this. The Brexit Party, which is the precursor party to reform, actually, the Electoral Commission issued a warning because they were taking so many donations under £500 on PayPal. We also saw the Bureau of Investigative Journalism did an investigation ahead of the last general election, which all the political parties except for Labour, they were able to give them small donations that would add up to over £500. So they show that mechanism just is broken, doesn't work. But I think your point is absolutely key. And this is the bit that's so significant. Again, the signaling is as much as important what Farage is saying on Bitcoin. It's this signaling about getting into a world where you can then have plausible deniability. The problem with our electoral laws is they all are based on plausible deniability. Yeah. Permissibility checks, the onus is on the party receiving it to do reasonable checks. The level of reasonableness is really just Googling. That's it. Whereas if you, as you say, you could set up an AI to just start making multiple micropayments very quickly going, and all of that doesn't have to be written down. We know everyone uses, disappearing messages now. It's not difficult to coordinate this stuff at all. It's really, really easy. Yeah. And so this is the thing. There's a huge gap here. And we're talking about, there will probably be an elections bill in the coming months where we start to see some of the outlines for it. But from everything I'm hearing within government, from all the people I talk to, the experts, what we're talking about at the moment is fighting the last war. It's tidying up some of the issues around different loopholes that exist in the system. There's actually, as far as I can see, nothing about what's coming down the track. And I think that's what's coming down the track in terms of crypto, what's coming down the track in terms of the ability to use social media for much more pernicious ends than we've ever seen before, the ability to use AI to disrupt elections, to make political donations, all of that. None of this is being considered as far as I can see at the moment.
I think you're right. Can I ask you one last question that goes slightly wider than your brief, I guess, but you're in in a good position, I think, to have a view. Sometimes I look at the rhetoric coming out of Reform and the Conservative Party, and I get, my spidey sense tingles a little bit. I get a suspicion that it's not yet directed at British voters, that what is happening at the moment is a bidding war between them for that money, for that socially conservative money, because I see some stuff coming out that I think, well, this is not going to be popular. Why would you take that position? Like, every poll shows this to be a hugely unpopular position. The only reason I can think that a conservative leader or a reform leader would take that position is because they're signaling actually to people like Musk with a vast amount of money to donate, to say, give it here. I'm more on your side, on your political side, than he is or she is.
I think I would agree with a lot of that, but what I think is almost just as significant is not just about donating money. It's about attention. It's about what they want to do. This is what I think is the big change we're seeing now. Money still matters, but just as important, and if not more important in some scenarios, is the attention these people are able to focus for positive or negative on top of what you do. Musk is the best example of this. Musk can use Twitter, X, to put attention on who you are and what you're doing as a politician. That can be really positive, as it has been occasionally for Nigel Farage. It can be really negative, as it was for Keir Starmer when Musk started doing all the grooming gang stuff around the turn of the year. If you look at the 2024 US presidential election, Elon Musk gave around $300 million, give or take, to Trump Republican campaigns. He also used X to try and put Trump in the White House. Everyone knows what was the most important part of that. It really was the latter. It was the ability to use a social media platform, to use the huge amount of attention he has to shine in a certain way. And I think that's what we're seeing as well. It's partly about signaling around finances, but it's just as much, or if not more so, around signaling around, that attention doesn't just have to be social media. Like, it can be what J.D. Vance says. It can be who gets invited to the White House with Donald Trump. That is all part of this. And that's the frame, I think, in which we're starting to see, which is a huge change. It's not just about trying to please a bunch of anonymous donors who the public can't see, who might give money to a think tank or whatever. That's one thing. What you're talking about here is showing your bona fides to this kind of transatlantic group of people who will then be able to lift you up or not, as the case may be. And in some ways, I think what we're seeing on the right of British politics is a competition about that.
Sorry, I know I said that was the last question, but you just gave me another one. Will we see, if America is that side of things, then America has geopolitical enemies who are also rich and tech savvy, like China. Might we see then an effort from China to start to interfere in European elections, let's say, to try and swing them the opposite way?
I wouldn't be surprised, though. We know, like the extent to which we've underplayed the attempts by Russia to interfere in our politics is still absolutely shocking to me. The Russia report, we won't go and retell the full story again, but the extent to which the Russia report was effectively suppressed. It took so long to get it out, and then once it came out, it was as if it never happened, despite a proper series of parliamentarians.
And it was gutted. A lot of the information was redacted anyway.
Completely, and this was real. And so the extent to which we've decided we don't want to even learn these issues, we've even seen it with attack. We know a couple of I think at least 2 or 3 Iranian nationals have been arrested and accused of applying to murder a journalist, an Iranian journalist in London. We also know of other Iranian influence operations. Our political system is incredibly porous and incredibly vulnerable to all these things. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is because we have designed it that way and decided every time we found a problem with it, like, for example, every time a problem is flagged, we do nothing about it. And I think the Musk donation, the potential Musk donation to Farage and Reform taking Bitcoin, in some ways is actually just, it's them signaling. And it's also because basically reading the runes of so far, they can say, well, actually, nothing's really going to change here. The chances of anything, happening that's going to make this impossible are really low. And we're actually signaling to an audience, not just in the UK, but I think a lot of the time in the United States.
Very interesting. Okay, so that's enough for today, but may I suggest a topic for your next investigation? I don't know if you saw the launch of Reform UK's Doge department. in the background, a man in a tech entrepreneur, apparently, in a baseball cap, who will be sent around councils, who has a background in data security, and will be sent around councils to analyze their data and find deficiencies. That rather got my interest peaked.
I actually missed this. This is very
Okay,
interesting.
well,
you give me some homework, Alex, so I'm going to go away
you go.
and do a little bit of digging. Thank
There
you very
go.
much.
The name of the man is Nathaniel Fried.
Well, that sounds like a very suitable Bond villain-esque name as well, doesn't it?
Yes. Peter, until next time, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. A total pleasure.
I hope you found that as discomforting as I did in a way. Complacency is the enemy here, a sense of it could never happen in our mature democracy. Not only it can, but it does. I have dropped a link to Peter's Substack in the show notes, where you will also find a link to the Quiet Riot bookshop from where you can buy several of Peter's books. Until next time, this is Andreou signing off.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.